Hello there, and welcome to the Palette Explainer. Tonight we'll explore one of Earth's most extraordinary and forgotten chapters, a time when the skies opened and barely closed for nearly 2 million years. It's a story written in ancient stone, whispered through fossils, and painted across the geological record in layers of sediment that tell of endless rain. This was the Carnian Pluvial episode, a period so drenched in water that it transformed the face of our planet, reshaping continents, oceans, and the very course of life itself.
As you settle in tonight, allow yourself to drift back through the immense corridors of time, back before mammals ruled the land, before flowering plants colored the world, back to an age when the first dinosaurs were just beginning their long journey toward dominance. Let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Tonight, we'll wander through steamy forests that never dried, across flooded plains that stretched beyond horizons, and meet the ancient creatures who learned to thrive in a world drowning in rainfall.
If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest. Let your body soften into whatever surface supports you. Let your mind relax its grip on the present moment and allow the ancient past to carry you gently towards sleep. Let's begin.
Some 234 million years ago, the world looked nothing like the one you know today. If you could stand on a mountaintop during the early Carnian stage of the Triassic period, you would see stretching before you in every direction a single massive landmass called Pangaea. This supercontinent sprawled across more than a third of the planet's surface, a titan of rock and soil pressed together by the patient hands of plate tectonics over hundreds of millions of years. Around this great island of land wrapped the Panthalassa, a superocean so vast it made our Pacific seem modest by comparison, while the smaller Paleotethys Ocean lapped at Pangaea's eastern shores. The world was simpler then in its geography, more unified. Yet in that unity lay extremes of climate and environment that would seem alien to modern eyes. Let yourself imagine standing on those ancient shores, feeling the hot wind against your skin, watching the strange sun set over waters that had never known a human gaze.
The climate of the early Carnian was what scientists call typically Triassic, which is to say, hot, dry, and rather inhospitable across vast stretches of Pangaea's interior. Because so much land was concentrated in one place, the interior regions, especially those near the equator, became furnaces of heat and aridity. Deserts of sand and bare rock stretched for thousands upon thousands of miles, baked under a sun that seemed to never tire of scorching the earth. Rain, when it came at all, came in the form of mega monsoons, supercharged seasonal storms far more intense than anything experienced in the modern world. These atmospheric monsters were born from the extreme distribution of land and sea, from the way heat built up over Pangaea's heart and drew moisture violently from the surrounding oceans. The monsoons would sweep across the coastal regions with devastating force, dumping unimaginable amounts of rain in short, intense bursts, only to retreat and leave the land to bake once more under merciless skies.
Adding to the complexity of Pangaea's climate were the central Pangaean Mountains, a towering range that ran roughly north to south through the supercontinent's middle, effectively splitting it into distinct eastern and western regions. These mountains weren't merely tall, they were massive barriers that cast enormous rain shadows across the landscape, A rain shadow forms when moist air rises to cross a mountain range, cools, and drops its moisture on the windward side, leaving the leeward side dry and parched. The central Pangaean Mountains created rain shadows of continental scale, rendering some regions even drier than they would have been otherwise. The mountains also influenced the mega monsoons, making their patterns more chaotic and unpredictable, adding yet another layer of difficulty to life's already considerable challenges. Imagine those mountains now, their peaks disappearing into clouds that rarely release their burden, their slopes dividing the world into zones of feast and famine for water.
Despite these harsh conditions, life had not only survived, but was beginning to flourish again. The Carnian was still relatively close in geological time to the Great Dying, the Permian-Triassic extinction event that had occurred roughly 50 million years earlier. That catastrophe had wiped out perhaps 90% of all species on Earth, leaving the planet's ecosystems shattered and struggling. By the Carnian, life had spent tens of millions of years slowly, patiently rebuilding diversity and complexity. New forms were emerging, experimenting with new body plans and new ways of life. The world was still recovering, still vulnerable, still finding its footing. But there was an undeniable sense of renewal in the air, a promise that the worst was past and evolution was once again accelerating.
Among the most significant of these new forms were the earliest true dinosaurs. In the semi-arid lands of what is now Brazil, in a region paleontologists call the Santa Maria Formation, small two-legged creatures were scurrying between sparse forests and along the banks of scattered rivers. These were the pioneers, the first unequivocal dinosaurs, and they were nothing like the giants that would later shake the earth. Styracosaurus, one of these early dinosaurs, measured only about 7.5 feet long, roughly the size of a large dog, and weighed no more than a medium-sized canine. It was a herrerasaurid, a type of early dinosaur with long hind legs, shorter front limbs, and a carnivorous lifestyle. With sharp teeth and keen senses, Styracosaurus hunted small vertebrates, the cynodonts and rhynchosaurs that shared its landscape, darting through the undergrowth on swift legs, seizing prey in jaws designed for tearing flesh.
Even stranger was Burrialestes, another early dinosaur from the same formation, smaller still than Styracosaurus. With sharp teeth, sharp claws, and a distinctly two-legged stance that seemed to scream theropod predator. Yet appearances can deceive across the vast depths of time. Burrialestes was not a theropod at all, not part of the lineage that would eventually give rise to Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor. Instead, this little meat-eater was a sauropodomorph, a member of the group that would one day evolve into the giant, long-necked sauropods like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus. In the Carnian, though, sauropodomorphs hadn't yet discovered the advantages of herbivory and enormous size. They were small, nimble carnivores, distinguished from theropods only by subtle features like a down-turned tip to the lower jaw and specific bone structures in the forelimb. To see Burrialestes running across the ancient landscape, you would never guess its descendants would become some of the largest land animals ever to walk the earth.
These dinosaurs didn't live in isolation. They shared their world with an array of dinosauromorphs, creatures that were almost dinosaurs but not quite, sitting just outside the technical definition on the evolutionary tree. Genera like Lagosuchus, Marsuchus, and Saltopus were even smaller than their dinosaurian cousins, some barely larger than modern lizards. They ran on their hind legs, their front limbs free for grasping, their movements quick and nervous. To the casual observer, they might have looked like peculiar reptiles, but they were something more, something closer to the dinosaurs than anything else alive. They represented evolution's experiments in that direction, alternative pathways that didn't quite lead to the same destination, but came tantalizingly close.
The archosaurs, the great reptilian group that includes dinosaurs, crocodiles, and pterosaurs, were producing other innovations during the Carnian as well. Phytosaurs, large semi-aquatic predators that looked remarkably like modern crocodiles but weren't closely related, were becoming more common. Edosaurs, armored herbivorous archosaurs with crocodilian body plans but plant-eating habits, were spreading across Pangaea. Rawisuchians, fearsome quadrupedal predators with powerful jaws and bad tempers, dominated as apex predators in many ecosystems. The Carnian was a time of archosaurian experimentation and radiation, a time when this group was trying out countless variations on the reptilian theme.
Beyond the archosaurs, other groups were stirring as well. The earliest lepidosaurs, the ancestors of modern lizards, snakes, and the tuatara, were emerging during the Carnian. These small, scaly creatures were just beginning their own long journey toward diversity, testing out the body plans and lifestyles that would eventually make them successful across the globe. In the skies, pterosaur ancestors, not yet capable of true flight in many cases, but possessing structures that hinted at their descendants' future mastery of the air, were appearing. They glided between trees, their wing membranes stretched across elongated fingers, catching insects and small vertebrates.
In the oceans, change was underway as well. The first placodonts, unusual marine reptiles that superficially resembled bulky marine iguanas or shell-less turtles, were adapting to aquatic life, crushing mollusks with their powerful jaws. Belemnites, squid-like cephalopods that would become important members of marine ecosystems for the next 150 million years, were just appearing in the Carnian, still small, still finding their niche, but already showing the body plan that would serve them so well. The oceans were recovering from the Great Dying too, slowly refilling with diverse life, experimenting with new forms, rebuilding food webs that had been torn apart. It's a milieu of post-disaster recovery, and that recovery is about to get burned.
This, then, was the world on the eve of the Carnian Pluvial episode. A world still recovering, still rebuilding, but showing tremendous promise. A world of experiments and innovations, of new groups rising and old groups fading. A world about to be transformed by something unprecedented in its recorded history. Nearly 2 million years of rain.
Beneath the surface of this recovering world, forces were stirring that would soon reshape everything. Along what is now the western coast of North America, deep within the Earth's mantle, magma was rising. This wasn't the slow, steady volcanism that builds mountains over millions of years. This was something far more dramatic, far more catastrophic. A massive, large igneous province, known to geologists as the Wrangellia flood basalts, was preparing to erupt. Large igneous provinces, often abbreviated as LIPS, are geological nightmares. They represent episodes of volcanic activity so intense, so widespread, that they can alter global climate and trigger mass extinctions. The Siberian traps had caused the Great Dying at the end of the Permian. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province would help end the Triassic. And now, in the middle of the Carnian, the Wrangellia basalts were about to make their mark on Earth's history.
Around 234 million years ago, the Wrangellia basalts erupted, not in a single explosive event, but in a series of massive outpourings of lava that continued for perhaps 1 million years or more. Lava flowed across the landscape in sheets, covering thousands upon thousands of square miles, building layer upon layer of basalt that would eventually be thousands of feet thick. The scale was almost beyond comprehension. But it wasn't the lava itself that would cause the most dramatic changes to the planet. It was what came with the lava: gases. Enormous volumes of volcanic gases poured into the atmosphere, and chief among them was carbon dioxide, that familiar molecule that traps heat and warms the planet.
The amount of carbon dioxide released by the Rangelia eruptions was staggering, even by the standards of large igneous provinces. It flooded into the ocean atmosphere system, accumulating faster than natural processes could remove it. The effects were swift and severe. Global temperatures began to rise, climbing perhaps 4 to 8 degrees Celsius, 7 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, above what they had been. In a world that was already hot, this additional warming pushed many regions into conditions that would seem unbearable. But temperature wasn't the only thing changing. The massive injection of carbon dioxide had another effect. It supercharged the hydrological cycle.
The hydrological cycle is the endless movement of water from ocean to atmosphere to land and back again, driven by the sun's energy. More heat means more evaporation, more moisture in the air, more energy available for storms and precipitation. The sudden warming caused by the Rangelia eruptions accelerated this cycle dramatically. More water evaporated from the oceans. More moisture hung in the atmosphere. More rain fell on the land. But this wasn't a gentle increase in rainfall. This was a fundamental shift in the planet's climate system, a shift that would persist for an almost unimaginable length of time. Making matters worse, the Rangelia basalts appear to have contained unusually high amounts of methane clathrates, frozen compounds of methane trapped in ice structures that normally sit stable on the ocean floor or in permafrost. When these clathrates are disturbed by warming or volcanic activity, they can release their methane into the atmosphere. Methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, roughly 86 times more effective at trapping heat over a short timescale. The release of methane from the Rangelia eruptions would have added an additional pulse of warming on top of the carbon dioxide, exacerbating the already extreme conditions, pushing the climate system even further toward instability.
The combined effects of warming and hydrological acceleration triggered something unprecedented in recorded Earth history. It began to rain, and then it didn't stop. For nearly 2 million years, the Earth experienced what scientists now call the Carnian Pluvial episode. The skies opened, and they stayed open, pouring water onto the continents in amounts that seem almost mythological. The rain fell in sheets, in torrents, in cascades that eroded rock and carved valleys and turned deserts into swamps. It fell on mountains and plains, on forests and barren wastes, on coastlines and deep interiors. It fell so heavily, so persistently, that the very face of the planet was transformed.
We will never know exactly how intense the rain was on any given day during the Carnian Pluvial episode. The rock record can tell us many things, but it cannot capture the sensation of standing in that ancient downpour, feeling the drops hammer against skin, watching the world dissolve into curtains of water. What we can say with certainty is that the rainfall was extraordinary, unprecedented in the geological record we can read. In some places, the rain eroded sediments so aggressively that it exposed the basement rock beneath, the ancient stone that lies directly above the mantle, usually buried under miles of accumulated sediment. To expose basement rock through erosion requires an almost unimaginable amount of water moving across the landscape with sustained force.
Other evidence for the severity of the rainfall comes from the widespread abundance of amber deposits in Carnian-aged paleosols, ancient soils preserved in rock. These particular soils only form under conditions where precipitation far exceeds evaporation, where the ground is perpetually saturated, where water is constantly moving through the soil profile. The amber itself, fossilized tree resin, indicates the presence of extensive forests, and the resin production may have been a response to the stress of constant moisture and the diseases and infections that thrive in such conditions. These trees were drowning in slow motion, their roots submerged, their trunks wrapped in humidity, their leaves dripping endlessly. Now, when we say it rained for 2 million years, we should be careful not to picture a single unbroken storm, a sky that never showed the sun for that entire span. That would be perhaps a bit too dramatic, though the reality was dramatic enough. What happened during the Carnian Pluvial episode was that rainfall rates increased dramatically above normal, and extreme precipitation events became common, not occasional. Instead of the mega monsoons being seasonal, they became nearly constant features. Instead of long dry periods punctuated by wet seasons, the wet seasons expanded and merged and dominated the climate. There would still have been variations, days or weeks where the rain lessened or even stopped, but the overall pattern was one of persistent, relentless moisture. The climate had shifted fundamentally from dry and hot to humid and warm, and it would remain that way for nearly 2 million years.
The effects on the landscape were profound and immediate. Regions that had been arid for millions of years transformed into lush, humid environments almost overnight in geological terms. Forests spread across formerly barren ground. Swamps and marshes appeared on scales that dwarfed anything in the modern world. The Carnian period, some 100 million years earlier, had been famous for its swampy coal forests, but now the Carnian was giving it competition. Peat forests, those waterlogged woodlands where dead plant matter accumulates faster than it can decay, were re-established across vast areas. The ground became spongy underfoot, saturated with water that had nowhere to go.
Floodplains expanded to continental scales, broad, flat regions where rivers overflowed their banks regularly, depositing sediment and nutrients across the landscape. Marshes, those transitional zones between land and water, became dominant features of many regions, their shallow waters choked with vegetation, their muddy substrates home to countless invertebrates and small vertebrates. Inland lakes grew to enormous sizes, perhaps dwarfing even the Great Lakes of North America, forming vast freshwater seas in the interiors of continents. These lakes would have been relatively shallow, their waters warm and murky, their shores lined with dense vegetation and prowled by semi-aquatic predators.
For anyone with a fear of water, the Carnian Pluvial episode would have been a nightmare made real. The world had become one enormous swamp, a planetary wetland where dry land was precious and rare. Flooding was not an occasional disaster, but a constant reality. Rivers swelled beyond recognition, carving new channels, abandoning old ones, creating braided stream systems of bewildering complexity. The sound of running water would have been omnipresent, a background roar that never ceased.
Yet even during this age of endless rain, the world retained some of its contradictions and complexities. Climate is never uniform across an entire planet, and even during the Carnian Pluvial episode, there were regions that experienced different conditions. While the general pattern was one of increased humidity and precipitation, some areas seem to have been affected differently or even paradoxically. Periodic episodes occurred where arid conditions would partially return, brief respites in the deluge, when the skies would clear and the sun would bake the sodden ground. These dry spells would not have lasted long by our standards, perhaps a few years or decades, but they would have provided temporary relief for organisms struggling with the perpetual moisture.
More surprisingly, some studies suggest that certain regions actually became more arid during the Carnian Pluvial episode, not less. This seems counterintuitive given the name of the event, but climate systems are complex and interconnected in ways that can produce unexpected outcomes. When enormous amounts of rain fall in one region, it can alter atmospheric circulation patterns that affect other regions far away. Monsoonal systems, for instance, can intensify in some areas while simultaneously weakening in others. The mountains and topography of Pangaea would have created rain shadows and wind patterns that could divert moisture away from certain areas even as others drowned. The most extreme example of this phenomenon appears to have occurred in the deep interior of Pangaea itself. those vast central regions that had already been among the driest places on Earth. Before the Carnian Pluvial episode, these interior deserts were nearly lifeless, scorched by temperatures that could literally cook living tissue, dried by conditions so extreme that almost nothing could survive. If these regions became even more arid during the event, as some evidence suggests, then they would have represented perhaps the most hostile environments in Earth's history, places where not even the hardiest of organisms could persist. Let yourself imagine those forsaken lands, shimmering under heat waves where no rain fell even as the rest of the world drowned, where silence reigned, broken only by the wind scouring across ancient stone.
But these were exceptions, anomalies in an otherwise wet world. For most of Pangaea, for most organisms, the Carnian Pluvial episode meant adapting to a new reality of constant moisture, of swollen rivers and vast lakes, of forests so humid that fungi and molds covered every surface, of skies that remained perpetually gray with clouds that seemed to never exhaust their supply of rain. This was not a cozy rain, not the pleasant patter on a roof that helps you drift to sleep. This was rain as a geological force, rain that reshaped landscapes and challenged every living thing to adapt or perish. And perish many did. Before scientists even understood what the Carnian Pluvial episode was, they had noticed something odd in the fossil record from this time. Extinction rates were elevated, not as dramatically as during the Great Dying or the end Triassic extinction, not a sharp, sudden die-off that marked a clear boundary in the rocks, but rather a sustained increase in background extinction rates. Species were disappearing at rates higher than normal, accumulating losses that over time amounted to a significant turnover in Earth's biota. For years, paleontologists wondered what could be causing these losses during what otherwise seemed like a relatively stable period. Now we know. It was the rain. Perhaps surprisingly, marine life appears to have suffered more than terrestrial life during the Carnian Pluvial episode, despite the fact that rain falls primarily on land. But the oceans are not isolated from what happens above them. They receive enormous amounts of runoff from continents, carrying sediment and nutrients and altering the chemistry of coastal waters. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, this runoff would have been unprecedented in volume and intensity. Rivers swollen to torrential proportions would have poured into the seas, carrying massive sediment loads that would cloud the waters and bury benthic habitats.
One of the major casualties appears to have been the carbonate platforms that had lined many shallow seas. Carbonate platforms are marine environments where calcium carbonate accumulates, often forming limestone and providing habitat for organisms that build their shells and skeletons from this mineral. The massive influx of freshwater runoff and terrigenous sediment would have disrupted these systems, altering water chemistry and making it harder for carbonate-forming organisms to thrive. The result was a crisis for many marine groups that depended on carbonate environments.
Conodonts, those tiny eel-like vertebrates with complex tooth-like structures that had been successful for hundreds of millions of years, took heavy losses during the Carnian Pluvial episode. Many lineages went extinct, reducing their diversity dramatically. Ammonoids, the coiled-shelled cephalopods related to modern nautilus, also suffered significant extinctions, losing numerous families. Bryozoans, colonial animals that formed encrusting mats and delicate branching structures on the seafloor, declined in abundance and diversity. Algae populations crashed in many areas. Crinoids, those stalked echinoderms sometimes called sea lilies, were hit hard as well, their delicate filter-feeding lifestyles disrupted by the cloudy sediment-choked waters.
Another impact on marine ecosystems came from changes in ocean salinity. Salt water defines the ocean, and marine organisms are precisely adapted to specific salinity levels. Their internal chemistry depends on maintaining the right balance of salt and water across their cell membranes, a process called osmoregulation that requires energy and careful physiological management. When you take an ocean and dump millions upon millions of tons of fresh water into it over hundreds of thousands of years, that ocean becomes less salty. The dilution might not seem significant on a molecular level, but for organisms adapted to a stable salinity over evolutionary timescales, even small changes can be lethal.
Evidence suggests that ocean salinity decreased noticeably during the Carnian Pluvial episode, particularly in coastal regions and semi-enclosed seas, where freshwater influx was concentrated. For fish and invertebrates living in these regions, the changing salinity would have been a form of slow torture, disrupting their homeostasis, forcing them to expend more and more energy just to maintain basic physiological function. Many would have failed, unable to adapt quickly enough, dying in waters that looked the same but felt fundamentally wrong. The background extinction rate in marine environments crept steadily upward as species after species found the new conditions intolerable.
On land, the situation was less catastrophic, but still far from ideal. Flooding on the scale experienced during the Carnian Pluvial episode would have destroyed habitats, drowned burrows, isolated populations, and forced species to migrate or adapt rapidly. Some groups simply couldn't keep up with the pace of change. Among the hardest hit were the rhynchosaurs, a group that had been doing extraordinarily well before the rains began. Rhynchosaurs were herbivorous archosauromorphs, more closely related to archosaurs than to lepidosaurs, that had appeared early in the Triassic and quickly become successful. They had lizard-like body plans initially, but by the Carnian, they had evolved into robust animals up to 2 meters long with powerful jaws designed for processing plant material. Their skulls were distinctive, with downward curving beaks and multiple rows of teeth that formed grinding surfaces, ideal for chewing tough vegetation. In some formations from the early Carnian, rhynchosaurs made up 40 to 60% of all vertebrate fossils, an indicator of just how abundant and successful they were. But success is no guarantee against environmental catastrophe. The Carnian Pluvial episode transformed the vegetation these animals depended on. The forests changed composition as species adapted to wetter conditions replaced those suited to aridity. The particular plants that rhynchosaurs preferred became rarer and rarer, replaced by ferns and conifers and other groups that thrived in humid, swampy conditions, but perhaps didn't provide the right nutrition or were harder to process. Unable to adapt their feeding strategies quickly enough, unable to switch to alternative food sources, rhynchosaurs declined precipitously during the event.
By the end of the Carnian Pluvial episode, nearly all rhynchosaur families had gone extinct. Only the Hyperodapodontidae persisted, and even they were living on borrowed time. By the next stage of the Triassic, the Norian, they too had vanished from the fossil record. An entire group that had been among the dominant herbivores of the early Carnian was effectively erased by the change in climate, unable to weather the endless storm. Similarly affected were the decenodonts, another group of herbivorous synapsids that had been hugely successful during the Permian and had survived into the Triassic. Decenodonts were therapsids, more closely related to mammals than to reptiles, and they were characterized by their distinctive skulls that typically featured a pair of tusks protruding from the upper jaw, hence their name, which means two dog teeth. They had been incredibly diverse, ranging from small burrowing forms to massive animals weighing several tons. Species like Placerius and Lystroceros had been common and widespread during the early and middle Triassic.
By the Carnian, Dicenodonts were still present and reasonably successful, but they faced many of the same challenges as the rhynchosaurs. The changing vegetation, the transformed habitats, the endless moisture that altered everything about the environment they had evolved to inhabit, all of these factors worked against them. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, many dicynodont lineages went extinct. The group as a whole survived longer than the rhynchosaurs, persisting through the rest of the Triassic thanks to their greater diversity and perhaps more flexible feeding ecology, but they too were ultimately doomed, disappearing entirely around 211 million years ago.
So the Carnian Pluvial episode was indeed an extinction event, albeit a drawn-out one, an event that operated through attrition rather than catastrophic die-off, through sustained environmental stress rather than sudden disaster. For millions of years, organisms faced conditions they were poorly adapted for, and gradually, relentlessly, many failed to cope. The fossil record from this time tells a story of loss, of once successful groups dwindling and disappearing, of ecosystems restructuring themselves as old dominance faded and new opportunities opened.
Yet here is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because extinction is only half the story of the Carnian Pluvial episode. The other half is diversification, innovation, and evolutionary opportunity. For every group that struggled and failed in the new conditions, another found the changed world to be exactly what it needed to thrive. The endless rain, the vast forests, the swollen rivers and enormous lakes, all of these created new habitats and new ecological opportunities for organisms that could exploit them. And some groups did exploit them, spectacularly. Chief among the beneficiaries were plants themselves. This should come as no surprise. Plants need water, need carbon dioxide, need warmth, and the Carnian Pluvial episode delivered all three in abundance. After millions of years of suppression in the arid Triassic climate, plant life experienced a renaissance during the event. Forests spread rapidly across regions that had been too dry to support them. Swamps appeared and persisted where previously only desert had existed. The diversity of plant species increased dramatically as lineages experimented with new forms and new strategies for exploiting the humid conditions.
Ferns flourished in the Carnian Pluvial episode, spreading through the understory of forests and carpeting disturbed ground with their delicate fronds. Ferns love moisture and shade, and the new climate provided both. They diversified into numerous forms, from tiny ground-covering species to large tree ferns that formed substantial parts of the canopy. Conifers, the cone-bearing seed plants that would eventually come to dominate Mesozoic forests, also underwent major diversification during this time. They evolved adaptations for growing in waterlogged soils, for tolerating high humidity, for competing in the dense forests that were emerging. New families and genera appeared, expanding the morphological range of the group and setting the stage for their later success.
The Bennetylace, an extinct group of seed plants that superficially resembled cycads, but were actually more closely related to flowering plants, also experienced significant diversification during the Carnian Pluvial episode. They would go on to become major components of Mesozoic floral communities for the next 150 million years. The evolutionary experimentation that occurred during the Carnian gave rise to forms that would define plant life for the remainder of the Mesozoic era.
This explosion of plant diversity and abundance had ripple effects throughout terrestrial ecosystems. More plants meant more primary productivity, more energy entering food webs, more resources available for herbivores. The expansion of forests created new habitats, new niches, new opportunities for animals that could exploit them. And one group in particular was poised to take advantage of these opportunities: the dinosaurs.
Before the Carnian Pluvial episode, dinosaurs were minor players in terrestrial ecosystems. They existed, certainly, and they were already showing some interesting characteristics, but they were not dominant, not diverse, not particularly common in most formations. The Santa Maria Formation might yield a couple of dinosaur genera among a much larger community of other archosauromorphs and synapsids. Dinosaurs were just one experiment among many, with no guarantee of future success. But after the Carnian Pluvial episode, something changed. The diversity of dinosaurs increased noticeably. The number of genera in a given formation jumped from 2 or 3 to sometimes nearly 10. Their abundance increased as well, with dinosaur fossils becoming more common relative to other groups. Their size began to increase, with some lineages pushing toward larger body masses than had been seen earlier. And their ecological roles expanded, with new feeding strategies and new adaptations appearing.
The Ischigualasto Formation of Argentina provides perhaps the best window into this post-Carnian Pluvial episode dinosaur diversification. This formation dates to the late Carnian, after the main pulse of the rain event, and it contains a remarkable dinosaur fauna. At least 8 different dinosaur genera have been identified from Ischigualasto, representing multiple lineages and ecological strategies. There were herrerasaurids, like Herrerasaurus itself, a predator up to 6 meters or 20 feet long, with large serrated teeth and powerful jaws capable of taking down substantial prey. Over 50 specimens of Herrerasaurus have been recovered from Ischigualasto, making it one of the more common carnivores in this ecosystem.
Also present were early sauropodomorphs like Aeoraptor, Eodromius, Panphagia, and Sanjuansaurus. These animals ranged from small, agile forms barely a meter long to larger species approaching the size of Herrerasaurus. They represented the early diversification of the sauropodomorph lineage, experimenting with different body sizes and feeding strategies. Some were still carnivorous or omnivorous, while others were beginning to shift toward the herbivorous lifestyle that would define the group later. The presence of multiple dinosaur genera in close proximity, filling different ecological roles, suggests that dinosaurs had achieved a level of ecological diversity and complexity that they hadn't possessed before the Carnian Pluvial episode. They were no longer just minor components of the fauna, but were becoming significant players, accounting for a noticeable percentage of the vertebrate community. The stage was being set for their eventual dominance.
Further evidence for the importance of the Carnian Pluvial episode in dinosaur evolution comes from the appearance of the first giant dinosaurs in the stage immediately following the Carnian. During the Norian, around 228 million years ago, we see the evolution of Lecemsaurus, one of the largest Triassic dinosaurs. This sauropodomorph measured about 12 meters or 39 feet long and may have weighed up to 10 metric tons, approaching the weight of a large African elephant. Compared to later sauropods that would reach lengths of 30 meters and weights of 70 tons or more, Lecemsaurus was modest, but compared to earlier Triassic dinosaurs, it was a giant. The evolutionary innovations that allowed such size increases likely originated during the environmental changes of the Carnian Pluvial episode, perhaps relating to the increased plant productivity and the opening of large herbivore niches as groups like Dicynodonts declined.
So the dinosaurs benefited from the rain, but they were not the only beneficiaries, nor even the primary ones during the late Triassic. The Triassic was the age of archosaurs, but it was not yet the age of dinosaurs. Other archosaur groups were more dominant, more diverse, and more ecologically important, and many of these groups also received evolutionary boosts from the Carnian Pluvial episode. Aetosaurs, those armored herbivorous archosaurs, flourished in the post-Carnian world. These bizarre animals looked somewhat like crocodiles covered in bony armor plates, but they were terrestrial and fed on plants rather than meat. They ranged in size from small dog-sized species to forms several meters long and heavily built. Their body armor, composed of interlocking osteoderms, protected them from predators and may have helped regulate body temperature or served as mineral storage.
Aetosaurs appear to have been better at exploiting the new conifer and fern-dominated forests than the rhynchosaurs had been. They diversified into numerous species and spread across much of Pangaea, becoming one of the characteristic animals of late Triassic landscapes.
Even more successful were the phytosaurs, semi-aquatic predators that superficially resembled crocodilians, but were actually distinct archosaurs that evolved a similar body plan through convergent evolution. Phytosaurs had long snouts filled with sharp teeth, powerful tails for swimming, and eyes and nostrils positioned on top of their skulls for hunting partially submerged. They were ambush predators, lurking in rivers and lakes, waiting for prey to come to the water's edge to drink.
For a group of semi-aquatic carnivores, the Carnian Pluvial episode was like winning the evolutionary lottery. The massive expansion of rivers, lakes, and wetlands during the event provided phytosaurs with vastly increased habitat. They diversified rapidly, evolving numerous genera and species adapted to different aquatic environments. Their size increased dramatically, with some species reaching lengths of 10 meters or more, large enough to threaten even fairly substantial terrestrial animals. Any sauropodomorph that came to the water's edge for a drink had to be wary of phytosaurs lurking beneath the surface, their eyes just breaking the waterline, waiting for the right moment to lunge. The abundance and diversity of phytosaurs in late Triassic formations is remarkable, and their success appears directly linked to the environmental changes wrought by the Carnian Pluvial episode. When you create enormous wetland systems, you create opportunities for semi-aquatic predators, and phytosaurs exploited those opportunities to the fullest. Turtles and crocodilomorphs, the lineage that would eventually give rise to modern crocodilians, also appear to have made significant evolutionary advances during or shortly after the Carnian Pluvial episode. Turtles, with their distinctive shells and ability to thrive in both aquatic and terrestrial environments, began to diversify during this time. The expansion of wetland habitats provided ideal conditions for early turtles, offering abundant food sources and protection from larger predators. Crocodilomorphs, similarly, found the wetter world more hospitable, and they began the long evolutionary journey that would eventually make their descendants among the most successful reptiles on Earth, survivors that would persist through multiple mass extinctions and continue thriving into the present day.
It's humbling in a way to think that the rain that fell 234 million years ago may have played a role in the existence of crocodiles and turtles today. The Carnian Pluvial episode was not just an ancient curiosity, not just an obscure geological event of interest only to specialists. It was a turning point, a moment when the trajectory of life on Earth shifted in ways that still echo in the modern world. The animals we share the planet with today, from the birds singing outside your window to the crocodiles lurking in tropical rivers, all carry in their genes the legacy of that ancient deluge.
But we cannot discuss the Carnian and the archosaurs without mentioning the Rauisuchians, the true apex predators of the late Triassic. These formidable creatures were quadrupedal archosaurs, more closely related to crocodilians than to dinosaurs or pterosaurs, and they were among the most fearsome predators the Triassic produced. Rauisuchians had powerful jaws filled with serrated teeth, stocky, muscular bodies, and in many cases, armor plating that protected them from rivals. They were the top of the food chain in most late Triassic ecosystems, the animals that everything else feared. The relationship between Rauisuchians and the Carnian Pluvial episode is less clear than for some other groups. There is ongoing debate among paleontologists about how much the event influenced Rauisuchian evolution. Some researchers argue that Rauisuchians would have followed roughly the same evolutionary path, regardless of whether the Carnian Pluvial episode occurred. Others suggest that the event had subtle but important effects on the group.
What we can observe in the fossil record is that many Rauisuchian genera appeared during the Carnian, specifically around the time of or shortly after the pluvial event.
This could be coincidence, the result of incomplete fossil preservation, or it could indicate that the environmental changes did create new opportunities for Rauisuchian diversification. Additionally, there appears to be a trend toward larger body size in Rauisuchians following the Carnian, though again, whether this is directly linked to the pluvial episode or part of a longer-term evolutionary trend is difficult to determine with certainty.
Genera like Saurosuchus, a massive predator measuring about 7 meters or 23 feet long and weighing around half a ton, appeared in the aftermath of the Carnian. Even larger was Fossilosuchus, though it appeared much later in the Triassic and may represent a continuation of size increase trends, rather than a direct result of the Carnian Pluvial episode. Regardless of the exact causal relationship, it's clear that Rauisuchians reached their peak diversity and maximum sizes in the late Triassic, after the Carnian Pluvial episode had reshaped the world. They dominated terrestrial ecosystems for the next 15 million years or so, until their extinction at the end of the Triassic opened the door for dinosaurs to finally claim the top predator roles.
The Carnian Pluvial episode, then, was not simply a story of rain and flooding. It was a complex environmental perturbation that restructured ecosystems, drove some groups to extinction, and provided opportunities for others to diversify and flourish. It was a filter, in evolutionary terms, selecting for organisms that could tolerate or even thrive in humid, waterlogged conditions, while eliminating those adapted to the arid status quo. The world that emerged from the event was fundamentally different from the world that entered it, transformed not just in its physical geography, but in its biological composition.
As the rain continued, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, life found ways to adapt or it perished. Forests grew thick and tall, their canopies closing overhead, their understories dark and humid. The ground became a mat of roots and fallen leaves and ferns, soft and yielding underfoot, never quite drying out. Streams that had been seasonal became permanent, carving ever deeper channels through softened rock. Lakes expanded, their shorelines advancing as water accumulated with nowhere to drain. The landscape was in constant flux, constantly being reshaped by the relentless action of water.
For the animals living through this transformation, life would have been challenging in ways difficult for us to fully appreciate. Finding dry ground for resting or nesting would have been an ongoing struggle. Burrows would flood regularly, forcing animals to rebuild or relocate. Food sources would shift as plant communities changed, requiring dietary flexibility or migration to track preferred resources. Diseases and parasites that thrive in human conditions would have been more prevalent, adding another stressor to already difficult circumstances.
Yet life persists, even in the most challenging conditions. Evolution is remarkably good at finding solutions to environmental problems, given enough time and enough genetic variation to work with. The species that survived the Carnian Pluvial episode were those that could tolerate the wet, those that could find food in the new plant communities, those that could avoid the diseases and parasites, those that could compete successfully in the restructured ecosystems. They were the winners of a 2-million-year competition, a test administered by the planet itself.
And eventually, finally, after nearly 2 million years, the test came to an end. The Rangelia volcanoes, which had been pumping carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere for so long, began to quiet. The eruptions became less frequent, then ceased altogether. The massive injections of greenhouse gases that had been driving the warming and the accelerated hydrological cycle stopped. Natural processes that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, processes like weathering of silicate rocks and burial of organic carbon in sediments, began to catch up, slowly drawing down atmospheric CO2 levels. As carbon dioxide concentrations decreased, global temperatures began to decline from their peak. The hydrological cycle, no longer supercharged by extreme warmth and abundant atmospheric moisture, began to slow. Evaporation rates decreased. The amount of moisture the atmosphere could hold diminished. And slowly, gradually, over tens or hundreds of thousands of years, the rain began to lessen.
It did not stop all at once. There was no single day when the clouds finally parted and the sun shone through for the first time in 2 million years. The transition back to drier conditions was gradual, punctuated by wet years and dry years, by regional variations, by the complex feedbacks and lags inherent in any climate system. But the trend was clear. The Carnian Pluvial episode was ending. The age of endless rain was giving way to something more like the conditions that had existed before, though not identical, because the world had been permanently changed by what it had experienced.
The forests that had grown so thick during the wet period did not all disappear, but they did contract and thin in many regions as precipitation decreased. Lakes began to shrink, their water levels dropping as inputs from rainfall and runoff diminished. Rivers decreased in volume, some reverting to seasonal flow patterns. Floodplains dried out, at least partially, becoming grasslands or open woodlands rather than perpetual marshes. The landscape, so thoroughly saturated for so long, began to dry.
For organisms that had adapted to the wet conditions, this return to aridity posed new challenges. Some populations found themselves stranded as lakes dried up, as forests retreated, as the habitats they depended on shrank or disappeared. There may have been a secondary pulse of extinctions as the Carnian Pluvial episode ended, though this is difficult to detect clearly in the fossil record given the overall turnover happening during this time period. But many lineages that had diversified during the event survived the transition back to drier conditions. They had evolved sufficient flexibility, sufficient tolerance ranges, that they could persist even as the specific conditions that had favored their expansion changed again. The dinosaurs continued their slow rise toward dominance. The adenosaurs and phytosaurs remained successful components of late Triassic ecosystems. The new plant communities, though modified, retained much of the diversity that had evolved during the wet period. In this sense, the legacy of the Carnian Pluvial episode extended far beyond its own temporal boundaries. The evolutionary changes it catalyzed, the extinctions it caused, the opportunities it created, all of these shaped the late Triassic world and, by extension, the rest of the Mesozoic era. When you look at a Jurassic landscape dominated by sauropods and theropods, or a Cretaceous ecosystem filled with diverse dinosaur and bird lineages, you are seeing the descendants of animals whose ancestors were shaped by the Carnian Pluvial episode. The long shadow of those ancient rains stretched across 150 million years of subsequent history. Modern climate science has taken considerable interest in the Carnian Pluvial episode as a natural analog for understanding rapid climate change. While the mechanisms differ, there are instructive parallels between what happened 234 million years ago and what is happening today. Both involve rapid injections of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Both result in global warming and intensification of the hydrological cycle. Both cause ecosystem disruption and stress on existing species. Both demonstrate that climate systems can shift between relatively stable states in geologically short periods of time. Of course, the differences are important too. The Carnian Pluvial episode unfolded over hundreds of thousands to millions of years, while modern climate change is occurring over decades to centuries, far faster in absolute terms. The source of greenhouse gases was volcanic, not anthropogenic. The baseline climate was different. The continental configuration was different. The organisms were different. But the fundamental physics and chemistry underlying climate change remained the same across geological time, and studying events like the Carnian Pluvial episode helps scientists understand the sensitivity of Earth's climate system to perturbations.
The rock record preserves the Carnian Pluvial episode in multiple ways across different continents. In Europe, there are deposits of dark shales and mudstones that indicate deep lakes and anoxic bottom conditions. In Asia, there are fossil soils rich in organic material, suggesting swampy forests. In North America, there are sedimentary sequences showing rapid shifts from arid to humid depositional environments. In South America, there are formations with diverse plant fossils indicating rainforest-like conditions. Each of these localities adds a piece to the puzzle, allowing scientists to reconstruct what happened globally during this extraordinary interval.
One of the challenges in studying the Carnian Pluvial episode is precisely dating when it began and ended. Radiometric dating of volcanic rocks can provide absolute ages, but these dates have uncertainties of hundreds of thousands of years at the timescales involved. Correlating rock layers between continents is difficult without precise dates or globally distributed marker beds. Different researchers have proposed slightly different timings and durations for the event based on different data sets and methodologies. The current consensus is that it began around 234 million years ago and lasted between 1 and 2 million years, but these numbers may be refined as more data becomes available and dating techniques improve.
What is not in doubt is that something significant happened during the Carnian. The evidence for a major wet episode is found worldwide. The biological turnover is evident in fossil records from multiple continents. The timing correlates with the Rangilia eruptions. The causal chain from volcanism to greenhouse gas release to warming to hydrological intensification to environmental change to biological effects makes physical and chemical sense. While details remain to be worked out, the broad outline of the Carnian Pluvial episode is well established.
For those who study deep time, who work with rocks and fossils to reconstruct ancient worlds, the Carnian Pluvial episode stands as one of the more remarkable discoveries of recent decades. It was hiding in plain sight, in a sense, evident in the rocks, but not fully appreciated until researchers began to put together evidence from multiple disciplines and multiple localities. It required sedimentologists studying ancient soils, paleobotanists studying fossil plants, paleontologists studying extinction patterns, geochemists studying isotopes, climatologists modeling ancient climate systems, and volcanologists studying large igneous provinces, all to contribute pieces of the puzzle. Only when those pieces were assembled did the picture emerge clearly, a period of extreme, prolonged rainfall that transformed the planet.
The story also serves as a reminder of how much remains to be discovered about Earth's past. The Carnian Pluvial episode is not mentioned in older paleontology textbooks because it wasn't recognized as a distinct event until relatively recently. How many other significant events in Earth history remain unrecognized, their evidence scattered across continents, waiting for someone to notice the pattern? How many other turning points in the history of life have left their marks in the rocks, but not yet in our awareness? The past is vast, and our knowledge of it, while substantial, remains incomplete. As you lie here now, feeling the weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow beneath your head, let your mind wander back to those ancient landscapes one more time. Picture the endless forests dripping with moisture, their leaves glistening with water that never seems to fully evaporate. Picture the vast lakes, their surfaces dimpled by falling rain, their shores lined with strange plants and prowled by even stranger animals. Picture the rivers, brown with sediment, swollen far beyond their banks, carving new paths through yielding earth. Picture the sky,
gray and heavy with clouds that stretch from horizon to horizon, releasing their burden in sheets and torrents that drum against leaves and stone and water.
Picture a small dinosaur, perhaps a herrerasaurid, standing at the edge of one of those swollen rivers, its head lowered to drink. Water streams off its scaled hide, accumulating in rivulets that run down its flanks and drip from its tail. It lifts its head, alert, eyes scanning for threats. In the river, something moves, a dark shape just beneath the surface. The dinosaur steps back quickly, instincts warning of danger. A phytosaur's snout breaks the water for a moment, then submerges again, the ambush foiled. The dinosaur turns and moves back into the forest, disappearing among the ferns and cycads, just another small player in an ecosystem still finding its equilibrium after the great transformation.
Picture the rain continuing to fall, as it has been falling for longer than any individual organism could comprehend, as it will continue to fall for longer still. The sound of it is everywhere, a constant percussion, white noise that fills every moment. To the animals living through it, this is simply reality, the only world they have ever known or will know. They do not wonder when it will end, do not remember when it began. They simply live, adapting as best they can, generation after generation, while the water continues to fall from the sky. And finally, picture the rain beginning to slow, so gradually that no single generation would notice the change, but over thousands of years becoming less intense, less constant. Picture the clouds thinning, the periods of clear sky becoming longer. Picture the ground beginning to dry, the lakes beginning to recede, the rivers finding their ancient channels again. Picture the forests changing as species adapted to drier conditions begin to spread again. Picture the world slowly, patiently, returning to something resembling its earlier state, though never quite the same, forever marked by what it had endured. The Carnian Pluvial episode was a test, a challenge, a transformation. It was 2 million years of rain that reshaped continents and oceans and life itself. It was an event that seemed impossible until we discovered its evidence written in stone. It was a reminder that Earth's climate is not static, not unchanging, but dynamic and capable of dramatic shifts on timescales both vast and, in geological terms, remarkably brief.
And now, as we draw our journey through deep time to a close, as we return from that ancient world of endless precipitation to the present moment where you lie comfortable and still, take a moment to reflect on the sheer scope of what we have explored together tonight. 2 million years is a span of time almost beyond human comprehension, a duration so vast that it dwarfs all of recorded human history many times over. The entirety of human civilization, from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the present day, represents less than 1% of the time it reigned during the Carnian Pluvial episode. Every empire that has risen and fallen, every monument built and eroded, every human life lived across all of history, all of it fits into a tiny fraction of that ancient deluge.
Yet even that enormous span, those 2 million years of rain, represents only a brief moment in the even vaster sweep of geological time. The Carnian Pluvial episode was one event among many in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. A single chapter in a story that began long before life itself and continues into an unknowable future. The planet has endured countless transformations, countless crises, countless periods of stability and upheaval. It has been frozen in global glaciations and baked in hothouse climates. It has been dominated by stromatolites, by trilobites, by dinosaurs, by mammals, and now by one peculiar species of primate that has learned to read the rocks and reconstruct what came before.
What makes the Carnian Pluvial episode particularly fascinating is how it illustrates the interconnectedness of Earth's systems. A volcanic eruption on one part of a supercontinent releases gases that spread through the global atmosphere, warming the entire planet, accelerating the water cycle, transforming ecosystems on every landmass and in every ocean. Life responds to these changes, some lineages declining while others flourish. And these biological changes then feed back into the environment through altered carbon cycling, changed vegetation patterns, modified soil chemistry. Everything connects to everything else in ways that can amplify small changes into dramatic transformations.
This same interconnectedness characterizes our modern world, of course. The climate system remains sensitive to perturbations, whether those perturbations come from volcanoes or from human activities. The lessons of the Carnian Pluvial episode, of the Permian extinction, of the end Cretaceous impact, all speak to the reality that Earth's systems can shift between states, that stability is not guaranteed, that life must constantly adapt to changing conditions or face decline. We are living through our own period of rapid environmental change. And while the details differ from what happened 234 million years ago, the underlying principles remain relevant.
But tonight is not a night for worry or concern about the future. Tonight is a night for rest, for allowing the gentle weight of deep time to put our immediate concerns into perspective. Your individual struggles, your daily stresses, your worries and fears, all of these are real and valid, but they are also temporary, transient, moments in a much larger story. The planet will continue its slow dance through space. Continents will continue their patient drift across the surface. Life will continue to evolve and adapt, as it has done for billions of years, and will do for billions more, until the sun itself grows old and swells, and ultimately makes the Earth uninhabitable in the impossibly distant future.
For now, in this present moment, you are here, alive, conscious, able to contemplate the vast sweep of time and to find some measure of peace in the knowledge that you are part of something much larger than yourself. You are made of atoms forged in ancient stars, assembled into molecules, organized into cells, coordinated into a living, breathing, thinking being. You carry in your body the legacy of billions of years of evolution, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of organisms that survived when others did not, that adapted when others could not, that persisted through ice ages and heat waves, through meteor impacts and volcanic eruptions, through all the catastrophes and transformations that Earth has experienced.
The rain that fell during the Carnian Pluvial episode eventually stopped. The volcanoes that drove it eventually went quiet. The ecosystems that were transformed eventually found new equilibria. And life continued, as it always has, finding ways to persist, to adapt, to diversify, to fill every available niche with creativity and resilience. The descendants of those Carnian animals are all around us today, in the birds that evolved from small theropod dinosaurs, in the crocodilians that trace their lineage back through the late Triassic, in countless other lineages that weathered that ancient storm and all the challenges that followed.
So as you feel your eyelids growing heavier, as your breathing slows and deepens, as your body relaxes more completely into rest, carry with you the image of that ancient rain, falling steadily on forests and lakes, on mountains and plains, on a world so different from ours, yet connected to it by an unbroken chain of cause and effect stretching across 234 million years. Let the sound of that rain in your imagination lull you toward sleep, a gentle percussion that has been falling not for hours or days, but for geological ages, a rain that transformed the world and made possible the world we know today.
Think of the small dinosaurs sheltering under broad leaves, waiting out another downpour, their ancestors having done the same for thousands of generations, their descendants destined to do the same for thousands more. Think of the phytosaurs gliding through murky water, hunting in the shallows, perfectly adapted to a world of endless wetlands. Think of the forests growing thick and green, their roots deep in saturated soil, their canopies dense with moisture-loving ferns and conifers. Think of all that ancient life, persisting, adapting, evolving, laying the groundwork for everything that would follow.
The Carnian Pluvial episode reminds us that change is the only constant in Earth's history, that the planet is dynamic and alive in ways that extend far beyond biological life, that stability is always temporary and transformation is always possible. But it also reminds us that life is resilient, creative, remarkably good at finding solutions to even the most extreme challenges. 2 million years of rain could not extinguish life. It transformed life, redirected it, selected for certain traits and against others, but it could not end it. And after the rain stopped, life continued its patient exploration of possibility, filling niches, experimenting with forms, creating the Mesozoic world that would endure for another 150 million years.
If you enjoyed this gentle exploration through deep time, this quiet journey to an ancient world of endless rain, I invite you to like this video, to subscribe to the Paleo Explainer for more peaceful explorations of Earth's history, or to share a thought in the comments below about what aspect of the Carnian Pluvial episode most captured your imagination. Your support helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time, seeking respite from the noise and rush of modern life in the vast, quiet spaces of the deep past. If you enjoyed this gentle exploration through deep time, this quiet journey to an ancient world of endless rain, I invite you to like this video, to subscribe to the Palette Explainer for more peaceful explorations of Earth's history, or to share a thought in the comments below about what aspect of the Carnian Pluvial episode most captured your imagination. Your support helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time, seeking respite from the noise and rush of modern life in the vast, quiet spaces of the deep past. But those are concerns for another time, for waking hours when the world demands your attention and energy. For now, you need do nothing but rest. Let the story of the Carnian Pluvial episode fade gently into the background of your awareness. Let the images of ancient landscapes blur and soften as sleep approaches. Let 2 million years of rain wash away the accumulated tension of the day, carrying it off into the same deep time that swallowed the Triassic world and all its strange inhabitants.
Allow your breath to slow even further, each inhalation and exhalation becoming gentler, quieter, less effortful. Feel the weight of your body sinking deeper into the mattress, supported completely, held safely. Notice how your muscles have softened, how tension has drained away from your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. You are here, you are safe, you are allowed to rest completely.
The rain continues to fall in your imagination, that ancient Carnian rain, but it is gentle now, soothing, a lullaby played on leaves and stone. It falls on a world you will never see except in your mind's eye, but a world that was real, that existed, that was home to countless living things pursuing their existence beneath skies that seemed to never clear. They did not need to understand their world to live in it. They simply lived, moment by moment, day by day, generation by generation, through the longest storm in Earth's recorded history. And now, 234 million years later, you lie here in darkness or in dimmed light, your mind drifting between waking and sleeping, between the present and the deep past, between thought and dream. The boundary grows fuzzy, indistinct. Images of ancient forests blend with whatever images your sleeping mind will conjure. The sound of rain fades into the sound of your own breathing. Or perhaps it is still there, very faint, at the edge of perception, that ancient precipitation still falling in some corner of memory or imagination.
For now, allow your breath to slow one final time. Let your shoulders soften completely. Let the last of the day slip away like water running downhill, finding the path of least resistance, flowing away into the past where it belongs. The Carnian Pluvial episode ended nearly 232 million years ago. The rain stopped, the world dried, life continued.
And now, in this moment, you too can let go, can stop, can rest. The world will continue without your vigilance for these hours of sleep. The planet will keep spinning. The continents will continue their imperceptible drift. Evolution will proceed, moment by moment, generation by generation, as it has done since life began, and will continue to do until it ends. You are part of that vast process, connected to everything that came before and everything that will come after, a brief flicker of consciousness in an immense stream of time.
But for this night, for these hours, you need only be still. You need only rest. You need only allow yourself to drift into sleep, carried there by images of ancient rain, of forests and lakes, of small dinosaurs and semi-aquatic predators, of a world transformed by water falling endlessly from cloud-heavy skies. Let that ancient world fade now. Let sleep come gently, naturally, inevitably. Good night.